On May 6th, Pluto turns around. When Pluto changes direction, understand this: it is not the weather that changes, not mood, not finances, not communication quality. Those are Mercury's domain. When Pluto reverses, what changes is the ground, the substrate, the layer underneath everything else. The assumptions so deep that they do not feel like assumptions, they feel like reality. The last time Pluto reversed in a new sign, entering retrograde in Aquarius for the first time, was 2024. Look at what shifted that year. Not the headlines, the ground beneath the headlines. The institutional structures that had been stable for decades began showing fractures. Political systems that seemed permanent revealed their contingency. Financial architectures that everyone assumed would continue indefinitely showed their expiration dates. Technology that was supposed to serve humanity began raising the question of whether the relationship might be the other way around. That was Pluto reversing in Aquarius at normal speed. Now imagine that at firehorse speed. That is May 2026. Over the last 7 weeks, since March 16th, this series has built something. Not a theory, not a philosophy, an architecture. A 12-video sequence of operations. Format the drive, write the blueprint, verify the build, map the financial patterns, identify the installed programs, rewrite the most constraining one, clear the transmission, accelerate through the firehorse, calibrate with the second strike, face the dark side honestly, and position for 7 years of informational restructuring. 12 operations, 1 architecture. The foundation is poured. The walls are rising. The wiring is specified. The horse is running at full speed on a clean surface with calibrated instructions and 0 transmission distortion. And on May 6th, the surface begins to move. This is the paradox that was teased in Video 4, the Firehorse promo at the end of March. The paradox. After maximum speed comes forced deceleration. Not because the horse tires, not because the rider falters, because the ground itself shifts. The horse can outrun any obstacle on stable ground. It cannot outrun the ground moving underneath it. Pluto retrograde is the ground moving. Here is what Pluto retrograde does that other retrogrades do not. Mercury retrograde distorts the transmission layer, the surface of communication, decisions, information flow. It affects how signals travel. The signals themselves remain intact. The channel degrades. Saturn retrograde slows structural processes. It introduces delays, revisions, reviews. The structures themselves remain intact. The timeline extends. Jupiter retrograde contracts expansion. Growth slows. Opportunities narrow. Ambitions are reviewed against capacity. The expansion itself is not invalidated. Its pace is checked. Pluto retrograde does none of these. Pluto retrograde interrogates the foundation. It does not distort signals. It questions whether the signals are being sent to the right address. It does not slow construction. It asks whether the building is on the right plot of land. It does not contract expansion. It asks whether expansion in this direction serves the actual architecture or merely serves the image of progress. Pluto is the slowest moving visible influence in the astrological framework. It takes approximately 248 years to complete one cycle. It spends roughly 20 years in each sign. When it enters a new sign, as it entered Aquarius in 2024, it initiates a generational restructuring. Not a personal one, a civilizational one. The themes of the sign become the themes of the generation. Aquarius. Collective structures, technology, freedom, the tension between the individual and the group. For the next 20 years, these themes dominate the structural landscape. When Pluto goes retrograde in that new sign, as it does on May 6th, it forces the first review of the restructuring it initiated. The review is not gentle. It is not a quote zero. It is an interrogation. Pluto retrograde asks, what did you build on this new ground? And is it real? In 2024, when Pluto first reversed in Aquarius, the review produced visible effects. Political structures that had been presenting stability revealed fragility. Elections produced unexpected results. Established parties showed internal fractures. Governance models that had operated on autopilot for decades suddenly required manual override. Financial institutions that had been treated as permanent infrastructure showed their contingency. Banking instabilities, currency questions, the quiet realization that the financial architecture of the last 40 years was designed for a world that no longer exists. Technology companies that were positioned as utilities, as essential infrastructure, too large and too integrated to fail, began facing structural questions about their role, their accountability, and their long-term viability. Those were the effects at normal speed, in a non-firehorse year, with retrograde planets muddying the transmission. In 2026, the same Pluto reversal occurs in Aquarius, but in a firehorse year, after a month of 0 retrogrades, during the execution phase of a 30-year Saturn cycle, and within weeks of Uranus entering Gemini for a 7-year information restructuring. Every amplification mechanism is active. The Pluto review runs at a speed and intensity that 2024 did not approach. The question Pluto retrograde asks is not, quote, one. That is Saturn's question. Saturn checks the engineering. Are the walls straight? Are the joints tight? Is the foundation level? Pluto's question is deeper and more uncomfortable. Quote, _2 __. This connects directly to the work done in Video 5, the installed programs. The April 1st diagnostic identified beliefs and scripts that were running as personality but were actually inherited instructions. The Easter protocol decommissioned the most constraining one. The question Pluto retrograde raises is whether the decommission was genuine or cosmetic, whether the program was actually removed or whether it was renamed, repackaged, and reinstalled under a different label. The architect who demolished a wall and replaced it with an identical wall in a different color has not restructured. They have redecorated. The spiritual bypassing diagnostic from Video 10 becomes relevant again. Is the current architecture genuinely the architect's, or has the old blueprint been given a new cover page? This is why the May corridor was teased since March, and why it was never fully mapped until now. It could not be mapped until the architecture was built. Mapping a stress test before the building exists is meaningless. The stress test is specific to the structure, and the structure has been under construction for 7 weeks. Now it exists. Now it can be tested. And on May 6th, the testing begins. Why this is a corridor and not a crisis? A crisis is an event that disrupts the operating environment from outside. An earthquake, a market crash, a pandemic. The operator is passive. The event happens to them. A corridor is a passage, a defined space with an entrance, a trajectory, and an exit. The operator enters it, moves through it, exits changed. The difference is agency. In a crisis, you are hit. In a corridor, you walk. The ground moves, but you are walking, not standing still. The walls narrow, but you are navigating, not trapped. The pressure increases, but the pressure is testing the structure, not destroying it. The May corridor is approximately 4 weeks long, from May 6th, when Pluto turns retrograde, through roughly the first week of June, when the retrograde's initial intensity settles into a more stable review phase. During these 4 weeks, every element of the architecture built since March will be stress tested, not randomly, systematically. The financial patterns activated in April will be tested for sustainability under changed conditions. The relational restructuring will be tested for depth. Was the change structural or performative? The vocational repositioning will be tested for commitment. Does the new direction hold when the ground shifts? Or does it revert to the old trajectory at the first sign of instability? The structures that hold under the stress test become load-bearing for the rest of 2026 and beyond. They have been verified by the most rigorous testing mechanism in the astrological toolkit. Pluto does not run gentle tests. It runs the kind of tests that reveal whether the building stands or falls. And structures that survive a Pluto stress test do not need to be retested. They are proven. They carry structural certification. Everything built on top of them can be built with confidence. The structures that crack under the stress test reveal their weaknesses before they become catastrophic. A crack in the foundation discovered in May can be repaired. A crack in the foundation discovered in October, after 6 months of construction on top of it, requires demolition of everything built above the crack. The May corridor is not a threat to the architecture. It is a quality assurance process. Harsh, uncomfortable, and ultimately more valuable than any affirmation of strength could be. This brings us to the closing protocol. 3 actions before May 6th. Not optional, structural. Each one prepares a specific aspect of the architecture for the stress test. Action 1. Complete everything started in April. Every open process. Every initiated but unfinished action. Every commitment that was begun but not concluded. Every conversation that was started but not resolved. Every financial transaction that was initiated but not settled. Close them. Not because open processes are inherently bad. In normal months, open processes are fine. But May is not a normal month. And open processes during a Pluto stress test are liabilities. Here is why, mechanically. Open processes consume resources. They run in the background, drawing attention, energy, and cognitive bandwidth. Each one is a small, ongoing drain, tracking the status, maintaining the intention, holding the space for a completion that has not yet arrived. Individually, each drain is trivial. Collectively, they are significant. And during a stress test, when the operating environment is running at maximum load, testing every element of the architecture simultaneously, that collectively significant drain is the difference between the structure holding and the structure developing hairline cracks at the joints. Think of it as closing all browser tabs before running a diagnostic on the computer. Each tab consumes memory. 1 tab, irrelevant. 73 tabs, the machine slows, overheats, and produces errors under load that it would not produce with a clean memory state. Close the tabs. Finish the April commitments. Send the emails sitting in drafts. Complete the financial transactions that are mid-process. Resolve the conversations that are hanging in ambiguity, not necessarily to a happy conclusion, but to a conclusion. Make the call. Send the message. Finalize the terms. Not perfectly, completed. The distinction matters. Perfection consumes infinite resources. Completion consumes finite resources and frees them for reallocation. The Fire Horse's April acceleration opened many fronts simultaneously. Pattern 1, sudden offers, may have generated new projects, new negotiations, new commitments. Pattern 2, old cycle closures, may have produced half-complete settlements. Pattern 3, redistribution, may have initiated financial moves that are mid-execution. All of these need to reach a resting state before May 6th. A resting state means either completed or explicitly paused. Explicitly paused means consciously, deliberately, with a documented restart date after the corridor. Items left in unconscious mid-process, the "I should really finish that" items that float in the background without a decision, are the most vulnerable to the stress test. They are the open windows during the storm. Close them or board them up. Either works. Leaving them open does not. Action 2. Lock in the second strike results. On April 17th, the second strike calibrated the architect's declaration. The updated blueprint, version 2, was submitted through the clean window at maximum amplification. In the 10 days since, that calibration has been executing. Some of the calibrated elements have produced visible results: a conversation that shifted, a decision that landed, a financial pattern that adjusted. Others are still executing, cued but not yet visible. Locking in means documenting what has changed since the second strike, not in memory, on paper. Take the second strike document and annotate it with execution results. Which adjustment produced a visible change? Note it. Which adjustment is still executing? Note it. Which adjustment has shown no movement? Note it. The annotation converts the blueprint from a specification into a progress report, and the progress report is the document you carry into the corridor. When the ground moves, when Pluto's retrograde questions the foundation, the progress report is the evidence that the architecture is executing. Not promised, not hoped for, executing. Documented evidence of execution is the structural equivalent of anchor bolts in an earthquake zone. When the ground shakes, the building that is bolted to its foundation sways, but holds. The building that is resting on the foundation without attachment slides off. Action 3. The stress test audit. Before the external test arrives, run your own. This is the pre-inspection. The walkthrough you do before the inspector arrives, checking every joint, every connection, every load-bearing element. Look at the architecture, all of it. The March declaration, the Easter rewrite, the second strike calibration, the financial diagnostic, the 7-year positioning assessment. Every element of what has been built over the last 7 weeks. And sort it into 2 categories. Category A, ready for stress testing. The elements that feel solid, not enthusiastic, not exciting, but solid. The commitments that are executing, not just intended, but producing visible output. The eliminations that held, the decommissioned program stayed decommissioned. The gap was filled with a specified replacement, and the replacement has been running for at least 2 weeks without reverting. The financial patterns that activated correctly, the sudden offer was responded to with pre-decided parameters, the old cycle closed cleanly, the redistribution is flowing in the declared direction. The relational changes that produce genuine structural shifts, not just changed behavior but changed operating language, as the Seattle engineer from Video 10 described. The vocational repositioning that produced not just new activity but new recognition, the kind where the body settles, where the specification and the reality match. These elements are ready. When the ground moves on May 6th, they will hold. They might sway, everything sways under Pluto, but they will not crack. They have structural integrity because they are genuine. They were built by the architect, not by a program wearing the architect's handwriting. They passed the Easter body check. They survived the retrograde. They were calibrated by the second strike. They are load-bearing walls that have been properly poured, properly cured, and properly inspected. The stress test confirms what is already structurally true. Category B, needs reinforcement. The elements that feel uncertain, the commitments that are technically active but lack conviction. You are going through the motions, but the body does not recognize the motion as genuine. The eliminations that reinstalled themselves, the old program that was decommissioned on Easter Friday and quietly resumed operations by mid-April, running the same pattern under a different name, generating the same constraint with a different justification. The financial patterns that activated but produced anxiety rather than alignment. Money moving in the right direction, but accompanied by the persistent feeling that it could reverse at any moment. That the new financial architecture is fragile rather than structural. The relational changes that look different but feel the same. A new person in an old pattern. A new vocabulary describing an old dynamic. The vocational moves that were made from pressure rather than precision, because the fire horse was accelerating and, quote, 4 felt more dangerous than, quote, 5. Category B elements are not failures. They are the elements that need reinforcement before the stress test arrives. Reinforcement does not mean starting over. It means Revisit the specification for each element. Is it genuine? Does the body recognize it, the settling, the structural click, the relaxation that indicates alignment? If yes, the weakness is not in the specification but in the execution. The direction is correct. The consistency is insufficient. Recommit. Tighten the daily action. Increase the repetition for the remaining days before May 6th. 2 weeks of daily consistency on a genuine specification can convert a Category B element to Category A before the corridor opens. If the specification does not produce body recognition, if revisiting the element produces not conviction but discomfort of the wrong kind, the __quote_6_ discomfort, the honest response is to downgrade it from architectural element to provisional element. Remove it from the load-bearing structure. Move it to a notes section, a holding space for elements that may be revisited after the corridor. It is not yet ready to be stress tested. Forcing a provisional element through a Pluto stress test does not make it stronger. It cracks, and the crack propagates to the elements adjacent to it, weakening structures that would otherwise have held. The stress test audit is the final diagnostic before the corridor. The full worksheet with the 2 categories, sorting criteria for each element, and a reinforcement protocol for Category B items is in the Telegram channel. Complete it before May 6th, not as an exercise, as preparation. Now, the preliminary map of May. Not the full map. That is the first video of the May series, with specific dates, specific configurations, and specific protocols for each week. But the contours, the shape of the terrain, enough to orient without claiming completeness. Enough to know which direction to face. May is structured around 3 tensions. These are not themes in the motivational sense. They are structural fault lines that Pluto retrograde in Aquarius will activate. Each tension produces a specific type of pressure on the personal architecture, and each one connects to specific elements of what has been built since March. Tension 1. Freedom versus control. Aquarius is the sign of liberation, collective consciousness, and the deconstruction of hierarchies. Pluto retrograde in Aquarius forces the question. Forces it, not suggests it. Whose freedom? Freedom from what? And at what cost? At the collective level, this tension manifests as institutional questioning. The structures that promise security in exchange for compliance, employment, government, financial institutions, medical infrastructure face Pluto's interrogation. Do they still serve, or do they merely contain? At the personal level, the question is sharper. The architecture built since March, is it a structure of genuine autonomy, or is it a new form of dependency disguised as freedom? This is where Pluto's question differs from Saturn's or Mercury's. Saturn would ask, is the structure sound? Mercury would ask, is the specification clear? Pluto asks, is the motivation genuine? A career change that looks like liberation, but is actually an escape from accountability. A financial restructuring that looks like independence, but is actually an avoidance of the responsibility that wealth requires. A relational shift that looks like growth, but is actually an isolation dressed as boundaries. Cutting people off, not because the boundaries are necessary, but because intimacy is terrifying and, quote, 7 sounds better than, quote, 8. Pluto's retrograde does not accept surface answers. It excavates until it finds the structural truth. And the structural truth, when found, is not always comfortable. Sometimes the honest answer to, is this freedom or escape, is, it is escape. And the architecture needs to be adjusted accordingly, not demolished, but adjusted to include the accountability that the escape was designed to avoid. Tension 2. Technology versus humanity. The Uranus and Gemini restructuring from Video 11, the 7-year cycle of information, communication, and decision-making transformation, runs directly into Pluto's retrograde question. Is the technology serving the architecture or consuming it? This tension will be felt most acutely by those who have been using AI tools, automation, and digital infrastructure to execute the April acceleration. The fire horse rewarded speed, the clean channel rewarded precision, and many people achieved speed and precision by offloading cognitive work to technological tools. That offloading is not inherently problematic, but Pluto asks, what was offloaded, the execution or the thinking? If the tools were used to execute faster, to send the emails quicker, to analyze the data more efficiently, to manage the logistics of the acceleration, the architecture is sound. The technology amplified human judgment. If the tools were used to replace thinking, to let the algorithm decide the priority, to let the AI write the specification, to let the platform determine the strategy, the architecture has a Pluto vulnerability. The question _quote_10__ is a Pluto question. And in May, it will be asked with the subtlety of a stress test, not the gentleness of a journal prompt. Tension 3. Old institutions versus new forms. The most macro of the three. At the collective level, May 2026 accelerates the visible decomposition of institutional structures that have been losing coherence since Pluto entered Aquarius. Political, financial, educational, and media institutions that were built for the pre-Uranus, pre-Pluto configuration find their structural assumptions challenged at the foundational level. Not attacked from outside, questioned from within. The employees who doubt, the executives who cannot articulate a 5-year vision, the models that no longer produce the outputs they were designed for, the stability that turns out to have been stasis. At the personal level, Tension 3 manifests as a question about dependencies. Which of the institutions in your architecture are still load-bearing and which are ornamental? A job at a company whose structural foundations are eroding carries different risk exposure than a job at a company whose foundations are actively rebuilding. A financial strategy that depends on institutional continuity, a pension, a government benefit, a platform's revenue-sharing model, has different vulnerability in the corridor than a strategy that is institution-independent. A relational life embedded in a community that is itself restructuring, a church, a company culture, a social group that is fragmenting, will produce stresses that are not personal but feel personal. The stress test audit, Action 3 of the closing protocol, should include an assessment of institutional dependencies, not to induce panic, to produce positioning. The person who knows which institutions in their architecture are entering stress is better positioned than the person who discovers it when the ground moves. These three tensions, freedom versus control, technology versus humanity, old institutions versus new forms, are the terrain of the May corridor. The full map, with specific dates, specific configurations, and specific protocols for navigating each week, is the first video of the May series. It drops before May 6th, before Pluto turns. Here is the view from altitude. The full arc, 7 weeks, 12 videos, 1 architecture. Week 1 of March, the 0 zone. 5 days of silence, the drive formatted. Old patterns marked for deletion. The silence protocol, the first practice this series gave, and the one that made everything after it possible. Without the clean drive, the declaration would have written onto corrupted sectors. The foundation of the entire build is that silence. Week 2 of March, the equinox. Saturn at 0 Aries for the first time in 30 years. The Architect's Declaration. 1 sentence, 3 commitments, 1 elimination. The 30-year blueprint submitted at 0 bias through a simultaneous ignition that had not occurred since 1996. The foundation was poured. Week 3 of March, the 72-hour diagnostic. 3 markers, people, past, body. The verification phase. For some, all 3 appeared. For others, delayed execution. For others, default right. The honest diagnostic, including what to do when nothing happens, that set the standard for every honest conversation that followed. Week 4 of March, the Fire Horse Map. The paradox, rest after equinox, was the systemic miscalculation. April is execution, not recovery. The 3 domains of acceleration. The May corridor teased for the first time. Energy is not depleted, it is invested. The return begins in April. Week 1 of April, the first week of the new code. 3 videos in rapid succession. The Matrix's prank on April 1st. 5 programs identified. The Diagnostic of Origins. The Resurrection Code, over Easter, death, void, new form. The algorithm that runs across every tradition. The fog lifts on April 7th. Mercury direct, 0 retrogrades. The cleanest window of the year. Recognize, rewrite, transmit. 3 operations, 1 sequence. Week 2 of April, the Financial Acceleration. The Fire Horse, money patterns. Sudden offers, old cycle closures, redistribution. The London Trader from 66. The Engineering Frame. Money is not energy, it is a byproduct of configuration. 3 diagnostic questions. Pre-decision as the horse's native strategy. Week 3 of April, the climax. The second strike on the 17th, new moon plus Saturn plus 0 retrogrades. Maximum amplification at the ignition point. The calibration of the declaration based on 28 days of field data. Then, the dark side. The conversation no one else has. Decompilation, the blank interface, the Seattle engineers' 70 days. Spiritual bypassing named directly. 3 states, nothing, worse, weird, each with a mechanism and a timeline. The most important video for competitor interception. The most honest video in the series. Week 4 of April, the scale shift. Uranus enters Gemini, the 84-year restructuring of information, communication, and decision-making. 3 projections for 7 years. And now, this video. The closing protocol. The preparation for the corridor. The final diagnostic before the ground moves. 12 operations. 12 practices. 12 diagnostic frameworks. 1 architecture, built from nothing, from a blank drive and a silent room in mid-March, into a calibrated, stress-tested, documented specification with a 30-year horizon. A 7-year positioning assessment, and a closing protocol that prepares the build for its first major structural test. The corridor is not a punishment. It is not a reversal. It is not the universe testing whether you deserve what you built. It is the final phase of construction before the building receives its occupancy permit. The stress test is the inspector walking through every room, checking every joint, testing every load-bearing wall. The buildings that pass do not need to be re-inspected. They stand, for years, for decades. The buildings that fail identify exactly where the weakness is, and the weakness, identified in May, can be repaired at a fraction of the cost it would take to repair in October after 6 months of construction on top of it. This is the last video of the March-April arc. 12 videos, 1 architecture. And the corridor ahead is not the ending. It is the verification that everything built so far is real. Not promised, not imagined, not affirmed. Real, structurally sound, ready for occupancy. Close what is open. Lock in what is working. Audit what needs reinforcement. May 6th is the entrance to the corridor. Walk in prepared. Your architecture is ready for inspection.